Imagine a future, maybe it's even the present, that feels, well, unsettlingly close to one of those dystopian novels. You know the kind. A society where our individual autonomy, our ability to stand on our own 2 feet, it just seems to wither away.
Yeah, replaced by this pervasive sense of dependency. It feels almost inescapable sometimes.
Exactly. And we're talking about something specific here, what our sources call a Huxleyan nightmare. Now, if you know Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, you'll get this. It's not about, like, iron-fisted dictators.
No, not at all. It's much more subtle. It's a nightmare of voluntary servitude, almost. People are kept compliant, kept in line through, well, comfort, endless distractions, entertainment.
A kind of manufactured happiness. They almost don't notice their freedom slipping away. They cheerfully embrace not having real agency.
And the irony, according to these sources, is that progress itself, the very thing we think is moving us forward, might actually be ushering in exactly this, what they call, and it's a chilling phrase, mindless consumerist zombie states.
Mindless consumerist zombie states. Wow. No actual change, just this sort of pervasive, almost happy complacency.
Yeah.
But the question we're really digging into today, the chilling part, is who's actually building this? Who are the architects of this subtle kind of control?
That's a huge question, isn't it? And the sources we've been looking at, they really don't pull any punches with their answers. What we're uncovering today is some, frankly, fascinating material that pulls back the curtain on who they see as the key players.
Okay, who are they pointing the finger at?
Politicians. But importantly, not just any politicians. They're portrayed in a very specific light, not as leaders in the traditional sense, but as anti-parents and anti-leaders.
Anti-parents, anti-leaders. What does that even mean in this context?
Well, it's about how they systematically cultivate a culture of dependency. And here's the really insidious part, according to these sources. It's not just about, say, government handouts for people struggling. It's framed as a much more pervasive, more sophisticated kind of control.
Pervasive?
It implicates everyone, both the poor and the rich. It ultimately reveals how these politicians, in this view, might be seen as the sources call them the priests of this evil anti-human sect.
Wow. Priests of an evil anti-human sect.
Yeah.
That's incredibly strong language.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a powerful framework we're dealing with. So our mission for this deep dive, for you listening, is to really extract the most potent insights from this material.
Right. To help you understand the kind of intricate mechanisms behind this engineered dependency they describe.
We want to help you recognize the shared culpability, how it supposedly spans across all parts of society, and maybe most importantly, how to spot the subtle signs, the sort of creeping nature of this neo-imperialistic shifts they talk about.
Because it's not just, an academic exercise, is it?
Not at all. It's about empowering you, the listener, to stand as a more informed, more critical thinker in a world that, let's be honest, often seems designed to keep us compliant. Comfortable, maybe, but compliant. Comfortable in our dependency.
It really is a journey into understanding how the very fabric of our societies might be subtly shaped, often without us even realizing it fully. It changes how you look at progress itself, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. So let's start right at the foundation, what our sources are calling the core betrayal. This idea of politicians acting as anti-parents and anti-leaders. Now, to really get the weight of that accusation, we first need to understand what the sources say is the duty of actual parents. What's that fundamental role, according to this material?
It's actually quite profound, but also quite simple in its essence. The sources paint a very clear picture. The main sacred duty of parents isn't just feeding and clothing kids. It's about raising them into independent, self-reliant adults who can build communities.
Okay, so it goes way beyond just basic care. It's about shaping their character, their capabilities.
Precisely. And capability here isn't just about having a job, The sources really emphasize that true parenting involves instilling critical thinking, not just memorizing facts, but the ability to question, to analyze, to forge your own understanding.
Right. And nurturing a strong sense of responsibility, too. Understanding consequences, the importance of contributing.
Yes, absolutely. And crucially, developing the capacity to lead. Rather than just blindly follow, it implies taking a proactive stance towards life, not just reacting.
So the goal is preparing children to, what was the phrase, face the world without crutches.
Exactly, without crutches. Think about that image. It suggests a kind of robustness, an inner self-sufficiency. It allows them to handle challenges, to maybe stumble, learn from it, and get back up again. It's about building internal resilience, not just relying on external props to get by.
And it's not just about the individual surviving, as it is bigger than that.
Much bigger. The sources push this idea. They emphasize that parents should be preparing kids to build rather than consume. That's a really powerful distinction, I think.
Build rather than consume.
Yeah, we're talking about fostering creators, innovators, people who actively shape their world, not just passively accept what's handed to them. The ultimate goal, to be creators of a better world.
Making sure each generation is, what, stronger, wiser, and more capable.
That's the idea. It's not presented as some lofty, abstract ideal. It's framed as the very core of human flourishing, a continuous generational cycle of empowerment, real progress.
Okay, so if that's the ideal of parenting, this deep understanding of parental duty, it sets up a really stark contrast, doesn't it?
A shocking contrast, really. Because the core argument in these sources is that modern politicians have fundamentally inverted this sacred duty, grotesquely inverted it. Instead of fostering independence, they deliberately, systematically foster a culture of dependency.
And what's particularly maybe unsettling is how they supposedly create systems that trap everyone, not just one group.
Exactly, both the vulnerable and the powerful. It's not limited to one segment of society. It's described as a pervasive, deliberately engineered condition.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting, maybe a bit uncomfortable too. Let's break down how this plays out for different groups, starting with what the sources call trapping the poor. They talk about welfare programs.
Right, programs often cloaked in compassion, as they put it.
But which, they argue, actually function as shackles. That's a strong word, shackles. How can something meant to help end up binding people?
Well, according to these sources, it's less about direct malice and more about the design of the system itself. They point to means-tested benefits as a key example.
Means-tested benefits, like benefits you lose if you start earning more.
Exactly. On the surface, it seems like a safety net, an act of compassion. But the deeper insight here is how they subtly create a kind of limbo, an economic trap.
A trap? How so?
Well, imagine someone trying to improve their situation. They take on a new job, maybe some extra hours, but then they find their essential benefits, housing help, food aid, maybe healthcare, start decreasing rapidly.
So rapidly that it cancels out the extra money they earned.
Often, yes. Or close enough that the extra work feels pointless. This isn't just a disincentive. The sources frame it as an economic disempowerment. It makes genuine independence feel like this impossible uphill climb.
So the system keeps people just stuck.
Yeah. That's the argument. Just afloat enough to remain dependent, but never really able to break free. The insight isn't just that these programs exist, but that their design actively perpetuates the very problem they claim to solve. It's an insidious kind of genius, or maybe horror, depending on how you look at it.
So it's not just about the money. It's about the impact on dignity, on agency. The sources mention the bureaucracy involved.
Yes, they argue it dehumanizes them, turns recipients into passive recipients rather than active agents.
What does that look like in practice, this dehumanization?
Well, think about it. Endless forms, intrusive interviews, constant scrutiny of your private life, often with this underlying assumption of mistrust, right? People get reduced to case numbers, data points, categories.
Not seen as individuals with potential.
Exactly. And this whole process, the argument goes, fosters a mindset of helplessness. You feel like you're always subject to external judgment, bureaucratic whims, and the ultimate, really tragic consequence. These policies are accused of destroying communities. They foster reliance on a distant state rather than enabling people to contribute to and build up their own local networks, their own communities. It replaces that vibrant, self-supporting community idea with just a collection of individuals all looking to the state.
A direct assault on communal strength. That's a critical point, the erosion of community from within. But the sources don't stop with the poor, do they? They talk about a parallel mechanism for enabling the elites.
Yes, this is where corporate welfare comes in. Think massive subsidies, huge tax breaks, even direct bailouts that prop up the wealthy and powerful.
How does that fit into the dependency framework? It seems like the opposite problem.
It's presented as the other side of the same coin, the same dependency coin. Just as the poor get entangled in one kind of state intervention, the rich are equally enabled, maybe even incentivized by another kind.
So the system allows elites to thrive, but not necessarily through genuine innovation.
That's the claim. Not through innovation, but through government favor. Instead of competing purely on merit, creating genuinely better products, or navigating market risks, These entities often secure their position through political connections, intense lobbying, getting preferential treatment from the state.
It basically creates an artificial advantage, right?
Yeah.
Skews the playing field.
Exactly. It distorts genuine market principles. And this leads to a really thought-provoking concept the sources introduce.
Which is?
The idea of a class of cosmopolitan corporatists. Now, this isn't just a fancy term for rich people.
Okay, so who are they?
They're described as individuals and entities whose wealth and power are deeply, fundamentally intertwined with and dependent on the state. They're described as being as dependent on the state as the poorest welfare recipient.
Wow. That's a powerful parallel. Dependent like a welfare recipient.
It's a stark comparison meant to highlight the reliance, and the sources don't hold back, calling them parasites suckling at the teat of public funds.
Parasites. Strong stuff. Can you give an example of who these cosmopolitan corporatists might be?
Sure. Think about multinational corporations getting huge tax breaks to set up shop somewhere, or financial institutions labeled too big to fail that know they'll get bailed out if things go south. Their profitability, in many cases, becomes less about market genius and more about their skill in extracting state resources or shaping regulations to benefit them.
So the parallel with welfare recipients is?
It's that both groups, at opposite ends of the economic ladder, become reliant on state intervention for their existence and prosperity. Neither is truly operating on pure self-sufficiency or market competitiveness alone. It highlights the shared outcome, this pervasive dependency that runs through the whole society, top to bottom.
And that's the critical insight, isn't it? In both cases, the struggling individual, the powerful corporation, the politicians, in this view, are acting as anti-parents. They're ensuring no one learns how to stand on their own.
Their power actually comes from this dependency, from keeping people dependent, unable to imagine a world without the state's constant intervention.
So it's not just a failure of leadership. It's actively working against self-reliance. A sickening perversion of leadership, they call it. Anti-leadership.
Precisely, because it directly undermines the autonomy and human flourishing that genuine leaders should be fostering. It's presented as a deliberate strategy.
Okay, so the politicians are the architects, the anti-parents. But the sources suggest it goes deeper, right? A sort of complicity throughout society.
Yeah, this is maybe even more chilling. It suggests the problem extends beyond politicians to parents themselves, the education system, the general population, which brings us to this uncomfortable idea of complicit parents.
Complicit parents, meaning parents who actually contribute to this dependency culture.
That's the argument. Parents who, consciously or not, abandon that fundamental duty we talked about, cultivating independence.
How so? What forms does this take?
Well, on one end, the sources talk about welfare exploiters, parents who actively teach their children to game the system, to navigate the benefits maze, get every possible handout, but without instilling a sense of contribution or self-reliance.
They call this sabotage, right?
Yes, sabotage, because it doesn't just hinder the child, it actively turns them into dependents who, the sources say, will never know the dignity of self-sufficiency. It's like perpetuating the cycle from one generation to the next, undermining their own kids' potential.
And then there's the other extreme, the affluent parents.
Right, the elite opportunists. These parents, instead of fostering resilience or genuine innovation, push their children into what the sources call systems of privilege,
Right.
like legacy admissions to elite universities, using complex tax loopholes to shield wealth, tapping into exclusive insider networks for jobs, rather than relying on proven merit in an open field.
And the result of that, according to the sources,
Children described as soft, entitled consumers, incapable of building anything of value. They're used to a life of curated ease, shielded from real challenges. So they lack the grit, the initiative, to be true creators or leaders. They consume, but they don't build.
So whether it's gaming the welfare system or leveraging privilege, the outcome is similar in a way. Children aren't being prepared to be independent builders or leaders.
Exactly. And this is where that stark metaphor comes back in. They're being turned into cogs in a machine of dependency and consumption. It creates this vivid image of a zombified populace.
Zombified. Let's unpack that. Obviously not literal zombies, but what does it signify in this context? What's the implication?
It's a powerful metaphor for losing individual agency, losing critical thought. A zombie, follows orders, consumes endlessly, lacks real consciousness or will.
So in this context,
It means people are so immersed in these systems of consumption and dependency, whether it's state benefits, corporate favors, or just constant entertainment and manufactured needs, that their ability for independent thought, for genuine creativity, for self-directed action, for building strong communities, it just withers.
They exist, they consume, they react.
But they don't truly lead or create or autonomously build. Their freedom is subtly traded away for comfort and compliance, which makes them perfect for a system that thrives on their dependence.
And this zombification isn't just happening within families, is it? It's societal.
Yes, the sources argue the general population is undermined in broader ways, beyond just direct benefits or specific family issues. One major mechanism they point to is overregulation.
Overregulation. How does having too many rules strangle entrepreneurship and push people towards dependency?
Well, imagine it as a kind of death by a thousand cuts for the little guy, the independent innovator. Someone has a great idea for a small business, or they're a skilled craftsperson wanting to sell their work. But then they face this maze of licenses, permits, inspections, zoning laws, compliance costs. Each rule might seem sensible on its own, maybe, but add them all up.
It becomes overwhelming.
Exactly, an almost insurmountable barrier. It makes it nearly impossible for individuals to innovate or start something new without either leaning on the state for grants or special permissions, or getting swallowed up by large corporations who have whole departments just to handle this stuff, or even influence the rules.
So it funnels activity towards established, often state-connected players.
Precisely. It stifles that grassroots innovation, that self-reliance from the ground up.
And then there's the education system. The sources say what should be a path to independence has been corrupted. How so?
They argue schools have shifted focus. Instead of fostering critical thinking, real problem solving, they prioritize standardized testing and conformity over creativity.
How does that shift impact a student's ability to be independent later on?
It's fundamental. If education is mainly about prepping for standardized tests, the focus becomes memorizing and regurgitating information, not deep understanding or original thought. Conformity gets rewarded over individuality.
You learn what to think, not how to think.
Essentially, yes. Or you learn to process information in a very prescribed way. The system, the sources claim, churns out graduates who are ill-equipped to navigate life without external support, because they haven't practiced independent problem-solving or self-directed learning enough.
So it produces compliant workers rather than critical thinkers.
That's the phrase they use. Perfect cogs for that machine of dependency and consumption we talked about. It's a huge departure from education's traditional role as a tool for empowerment.
So when you put all these pieces together, the anti-parent political psychosis from the top, this widespread societal complicity from parents and schools, the result is...
The cumulative result, according to these sources, is really quite dire. A society where no one is prepared to lead or build. The very idea of the independent community builder, someone who fosters local strength, becomes an endangered species.
And the general population, rich or poor, is just trapped in a cycle of consumption and debt.
That's the grim picture painted, a systemic decline in human potential, in agency.
This systemic decline, this engineered dependency, it naturally leads us to the next big theme, what the sources call the new imperialism.
Right. And this idea fundamentally challenges how we usually think about empires. They argue that the whole notion that empires ended after World War II might just be an illusion.
An illusion, like the end of history idea after the Soviet Union fell.
Exactly like that. Many celebrated the end of history back then, thinking liberal democracy had won, ideological conflict was over.
But these sources say that wasn't the end.
No. They argue that the apparent triumph of liberal democracy in 1989 didn't lead to a truly free world. Instead, it ushered in a new form of imperialism, operating more subtly under the banner of liberal hegemony.
Liberal hegemony, okay.
Yeah.
So it wasn't the end of global power plays, just a transformation. How does this liberal hegemony work in practice, according to them?
Well, it's mainly a form of soft power. Liberal democratic powers didn't always invade with armies like old empires. Instead, they expanded influence by promoting specific norms, values, institutions.
Like free markets, democratic elections, human rights frameworks.
Precisely. International legal systems, too. And this promotion often happened through interventions, military, political, and economic, but always, crucially, under the pretext of spreading democracy and protecting human rights.
Okay, but what's the catch? What's the imperialistic part?
Here's the paradox they highlight. These actions, even with seemingly good intentions, paradoxically lead to the destruction of human agency through their right to become independent, norm-forming communities.
Okay, wait. Destroying agency by promoting democracy and human rights. How does that work?
By imposing a universal set of norms from the outside, they argue it strips away a community's inherent right and ability to define its own way of life, its own values, its own internal rules. It's a critique of how global influence, even when it seems benign, can undermine local autonomy and self-determination at a really fundamental level.
And what's crucial here is that they say this modern imperialism is ideology agnostic. It's not just about liberalism.
Exactly. It can manifest under various political spectrums. So it doesn't matter if the system calls itself liberal, conservative, capitalist, socialist. The sources insist we look past the labels.
Focus on the underlying actions and consequences.
Right. What do the actions do to human agency, to community bonds? Not what ideology do they claim to represent. The impact is what matters, not the justification.
Okay, so central to understanding this new imperialism is defining what they mean by an independent norm-forming community. What is that exactly?
They give a very detailed definition. It's a collective of individuals endowed with the inherent capacity, willingness, and dedication to autonomously create norms that frame and guide all dimensions of their communal existence.
So not just people living near each other. It's a group with the active ability and the will to self-govern their shared life. Social customs, economic practices, everything.
Yes, genuine self-determination. Deep, local, organic. And they make this crucial distinction between community, or Gemeinschaft, and society, or Gesellschaft. Can you break that down? It sounds important.
Absolutely. Think of Gemeinschaft, like your close family, maybe a really tight-knit traditional village. Everyone knows everyone, shares customs, they truly live together. It's rooted in organic connection, almost instinctual.
Where the norms aren't necessarily written down, they're just understood.
Exactly. They're existentially available, as the sources put it, just part of the shared life. This is where people can freely establish norms through interaction. Now, Gesellschaft, or society, is more like a huge city, a modern corporation, maybe a whole nation state.
More transactional, less personal.
Right. People talk together to make agreements, transact business, set up formal laws. The connections are more functional, mechanistic. It's about shared rules, division of labor, but maybe less about a shared soul or those deep living bonds.
And why is this distinction so vital for understanding imperialism?
Because, the argument goes, imperial powers thrive in the Gesellschaft framework. It allows for top-down control, standardized norms, whereas those independent Gemeinschaft communities are precisely what they need to undermine. They're harder to control.
So this redefines community. It champions autonomy, participative governance, and deep respect for individual contributions within a livable collective framework.
Ian contrasts that explicitly with the unlivable construct of a global ideological empire, which by its nature can't have that organic, self-determined quality. Which brings us to the core fear. Why are these self-governing communities the ultimate threat to this new imperialism?
This is central to the whole argument. Imperialists fear independent norm-forming communities most because it is the only legitimate orchestration of human intentions able to break free from their empire.
The only legitimate orchestration able to break free. Wow.
Think about it. If people can genuinely self-organize, create their own norms, provide for themselves collectively, economically, socially, culturally, they become truly independent.
They don't need the empire's systems, its care, its favors.
Exactly. They become fundamentally ungovernable by those external imperial forces. They represent a living, breathing alternative to the empire's top-down dependency model. That's why they're targeted. They pose an existential challenge to the structure of imperial control and to that Huxleyan nightmare of compliant, dependent citizens.
Okay, that foundational understanding, what these communities are, why they're a threat, really sets the stage perfectly for this next part. We need to dive into the 18 behaviors of modern imperialists.
Right. This is where the sources get really specific, breaking down the strategies, the agendas used to foster dependency and crush that autonomy.
We're going to see the mechanisms of control in pretty chilling granular detail, how those architects of dependency actually put their vision into practice to create those mindless consumerist zombie states.
Okay, let's start with what the sources group as direct assaults on community foundations. The very first one, maybe the most crucial, is behavior 1, preventing independent norm-forming communities.
The prime directive, basically.
You could say that. Imperial powers prioritize suppressing these communities because, as we said, they're a profound and legitimate challenge to imperial control. Think of a resilient village solving its own problems, educating its kids its own way, trading locally, not needing national or international bodies.
It's outside the empire's direct control.
And its very existence proves self-sufficiency is possible. That example can fundamentally disrupt the hegemony of an empire. It undermines the whole narrative that the big state, the empire, is essential. It's a direct threat.
And then there's behavior 4, destroying civilizations that protect communities. This sounds even more aggressive. Not just preventing, but actively dismantling.
Yeah, it goes a step further. The drive is to dismantle civilizations that support and safeguard independent, norm-forming communities. Think about indigenous cultures historically, or maybe decentralized systems that nurtured local power.
Why target the whole civilization, though, not just the individual communities?
Because those civilizations, the sources argue, foster an ecology of autonomous communities. They're not just isolated units. They exist within a larger supportive framework that's not the monolithic imperial state. They might act as a dynamic alliance, helping each other resist domination in ways the empire can't easily counter.
So to clear the field, the whole supportive ecosystem has to go.
Exactly. Remove the alternatives, pave the way for a uniform, dependent landscape controlled by the empire.
And related to this, there's behavior 10, promoting suboptimal communities. This sounds more subtle. What does that involve?
It's quite cunning, actually. Imperialists strategically support the proliferation of suboptimal and/or dysfunctional communities. Why would they do that?
Because weak communities aren't a threat.
Precisely. They recognize that these fragmented, internally conflicted, inefficient groups lack the resilience and cohesion to challenge imperial power. Imagine communities bogged down in internal squabbles, lacking strong leadership, unable to manage their own resources effectively.
They're easier to manipulate, more likely to need outside staff.
Exactly. They pose no unified threat. By subtly encouraging disunity, conflict, or just plain inefficiency, the imperial powers prevent any real coherent challenge from emerging. Genuine self-determination remains out of reach.
Okay, moving on to the next category. Strategies of homogenization and control through individualism. This feels like it gets into the psychological aspects.
Very much so. Take behavior 2, forcing diverse communities into a single state. The sources detail how imperialists force independent norm-forming communities into a globally sovereign state that contains vast diversity.
How is forcing diversity into one state a tool of control?
Yeah.
Isn't diversity usually seen as good?
The argument here is that it makes concepts like nation and nation-state meaningless. Think about imposing one single national identity onto wildly different ethnic, cultural, religious groups who previously governed themselves.
It dilutes their original identities.
Yes, and it's not about celebrating diversity. It's about using diversity to stifle those organic inter-community bonds. When a state is too diverse, genuine solidarity becomes incredibly difficult. Local bonds get replaced by a manufactured, often shallow, national identity that ultimately serves the imperial project. It weakens the power of unique community norms from the ground up.
And then there's behavior 3, multiculturalism as a melting pot. This sounds like twisting a positive idea.
That's exactly the claim, that multiculturalism gets strategically manipulated into a melting pot strategy. The goal isn't genuine exchange where unique cultures thrive side by side.
What's the goal then?
To erode the distinct norms established by independent communities. It pushes for blending, for homogenization where distinct identities get diluted, eventually dissolving into a generic, state-approved cultural conformity.
So it's not real diversity, it's flattening differences.
Right, turning unique cultural ways of life into consumer choices or trends, rather than foundations for self-governance. It removes those deeply rooted community norms that might challenge the empire.
Okay, this next one sounds particularly stark. Behavior 7, breeding isolated individuals. What on earth does that mean?
It's a really profound claim. Imperialists don't fear independent individuals who have no real community bonds. Think about that. An individual alone isn't a threat to the empire.
So they want isolated individuals.
The sources say they actively breed them. Cultivate atomized individuals through things like internationalist institutions, global narratives that emphasize global identity over local roots, maybe even online interactions replacing deep physical community.
And how are these isolated individuals used?
Paradoxically, as tools to undermine and dismantle independent norm-forming communities. The very things the empire fears most. An isolated person, disconnected from deep community norms and bonds, is far more susceptible to external influence, far less capable of collective resistance or building something lasting with others.
They become unwitting agents of the empire.
Often unknowingly, yes. working against their own potential for true belonging and collective strength.
And a very current example of this might be Behavior 11, identity politics as a virus. How is identity politics framed here?
The sources unpack how the universalist claims within identity politics get manipulated as a virus that turns individuals into victim zombies programmed to destroy independent norm-forming communities.
Victim zombies. That's intense. How does it work?
Well, while promoting awareness of identity and grievances might seem positive, the imperialist strategy, according to this view, weaponizes it. It fragments society into countless competing identity groups.
Each focused on its own victimhood, demanding recognition from a central authority.
Exactly. And in doing so, the bonds of shared community, based on local norms and mutual support, get dissolved. Instead of uniting around common local needs, people are encouraged to see each other through these external, often antagonistic, identity categories.
It fragments the social fabric from within, prevents unified action.
Precisely. It turns internal divisions into weapons against community cohesion, a kind of self-destruct mechanism for solidarity.
And that links directly to Behavior 16, individual rights over community rights, doesn't it?
It does. The sources explain how human rights frameworks, which sound universally good, are often implemented to prioritize individual rights at the expense of community rights.
But individual rights are important.
Of course. The argument isn't that individual rights are bad. It's that this prioritization is a calculated strategy to weaken independent norm-forming communities. By emphasizing only individual claims, these frameworks can undermine the collective decision-making, the traditional practices, the shared responsibilities that define a healthy, functioning community. If any individual can appeal to an external, universal right that trumps the community's own self-established norms,
It isolates the individual from their collective strength, makes them reliant on an external authority.
Yes, reliant on an external, legal, or moral authority, ultimately, the imperial power, rather than their own community's ways of governing itself.
And the last one in this category, Behavior 18, monopolizing understanding and knowledge. What does this entail?
It's about a systematic co-option and control of the avenues through which individuals seek understanding. Think mainstream media, academic institutions, maybe even the big global digital platforms.
Controlling the information flow.
Essentially, yes. The goal is to reinforce reliance on imperial narratives and actively undermine trust in community knowledge and local ways of learning and socializing. If the empire controls what counts as true or credible,
It can shape opinion, discredit alternatives, prevent independent thought from forming within communities.
exactly. It's about controlling the whole epistemological landscape, making sure people look outwards to the imperial center for their truth rather than inwards to their own community's wisdom or shared experience.
Okay, let's shift gears to the economic and systemic mechanisms of control. This seems crucial for how dependency gets baked into the system.
Absolutely. Take Behavior 5. Monetary systems favoring elites. This talks about establishing global monetary systems that prioritize imperial transactional trust.
Imperial transactional trust, what's that?
It means trust is placed in large, centralized institutions, global financial flows, often bypassing or undermining local community-based economies. These systems, the sources argue, disproportionately benefit the imperial ruling elites, those cosmopolitan corporatists we mentioned earlier.
And what's the effect on ordinary people?
It creates a situation where the average person, described here as the zombified individual as the base economic actor, is forced into a system of constant consumption and debt. They're disconnected from creating real value within their own community.
While actual community wealth, built locally, gets eroded.
Yes, systematically eroded. Ensuring financial flows always support the empire's interests and dominance, not local thriving.
And linked to that is Behavior 9, forcing internationalist investments. How does this work?
Imperial powers, the sources claim, systematically enforce investment strategies and corporate behaviors that align with internationalist principles. Think pushing global supply chains, massive foreign investments, corporate structures that prioritize international capital over local needs.
And this deliberately suppresses local and regional economic autonomy.
That's the argument. For example, a small town might have a perfectly viable local industry, but an imperial strategy might promote outsourcing or bring in a mega corporation that drives a local businesses under.
Redirecting wealth away from the community, making it dependent on global systems.
Exactly. Economic prosperity gets tied to serving broader imperial interests, not local self-sufficiency, deepening that dependency.
And this brings us back to welfare, but from a different angle. Behavior 14, welfare as a tool for invalidating independence.
Right. Here, welfare isn't just seen as compassionate, but as strategically deployed as a mechanism to undermine the autonomy of independent norm-forming communities.
We talk about the trap it creates for individuals, but this is about the community level.
Yes. By positioning external aid as essential for survival, it subtly erodes a community's own drive and capacity for self-determination and collective resilience. If the state provides all the answers, why bother developing your own solutions?
It weakens that internal drive, that spirit of fair play, work, and thrift.
That's the claim, replacing it with reliance on external provision, which weakens internal governance and the collective spirit needed for true independence.
Okay, the final category. Manipulation of concepts, leaders, and values. This feels like the psychological and cultural warfare aspect.
You could put it that way. Starting with behavior 6, WMDs as imperial legitimacy. This is pretty chilling.
How can weapons of mass destruction legitimize an empire?
The argument is that imperial powers strategically represent the mere existence of weapons of mass destruction as a legitimizing aspect of their imperial ambitions. Instead of seeing them as tools to protect diverse, self-governing groups, to safeguard the dynamic balancing alliance sphere where independent norm-forming communities thrive.
They're reframed how?
As symbols of ultimate power, a tacit threat that asserts global dominance and ensures compliance, the underlying message becomes, we have the ultimate destructive power, therefore our global authority is unquestionable.
So a potential shield becomes a tool for control and enforced submission. Grim. What about behavior 8? Coercing leaders to internationalism.
This is described as a powerful way to drain talent and disempower communities. Established and emerging leaders, the very people who should be strengthening their local communities, are lured with promises of greater influence and opportunities on an international stage.
Offered prestigious international jobs, speaking gigs, access to power networks.
Exactly. And this persuades them to prioritize the empire's agenda over their own community's needs. Their allegiance subtly shifts. This effectively strips communities of their leadership, siphoning off vital talent, leaving the community weaker and more vulnerable.
And then behavior 12. Universal truth claims against local norms. How does this undermine communities?
It's described as a really insidious form of cultural subversion. Imperial powers exploit the universal truth claims of religions and the philosophical assertions of ideologies like capitalism, socialism, communism, and atheism.
How does exploiting universal truths undermine local norms?
Every community has its own unique norms, often unwritten, rooted in its specific history and experience. But when an external power imposes a universal truth, whether it's religious dogma, economic theory, political ideology, it inherently questions and seeks to invalidate those specific local norms.
It creates internal divisions, makes local ways seem inferior.
Yes. It prevents unity by creating arguments around these external claims. It erodes the community's self-confidence in its own unique identity and ways of doing things.
This next one feels very relevant today. Behavior 13. Science as monolithic authority.
Extremely relevant. This describes leveraging the universal appeal of scientific authority, but crucially, using a selective interpretation of data.
To assert what?
A monolithic, amoral interpretation that can override and invalidate local norms and practices. Think about it. A local community might have traditional farming methods or health practices that work perfectly for them, developed over generations.
But an external scientific authority declares them outdated or inefficient.
Right, based on universal metrics that ignore the local context. This dismantles local wisdom and self-reliance. The sources chillingly suggest this reduces humans to bacteria-like atomized utility optimizers.
Stripping away our social context, our community connections, pushing us towards a single, efficient, but maybe soulless way of being.
All in the name of science. It's using knowledge as a tool to control behavior, ignoring the richness of social ecology.
And then there's behavior 15, caring as control. This sounds counterintuitive.
It's one of the most subtle manipulations described. Imperialists cloak their interventions in communities under the guise of an exaggerated concern for care and justice. Humanitarian aid, environmental campaigns, social justice initiatives.
Things that seem good on the surface.
Exactly. But the underlying mechanism, the sources argue, is to subtly erode the community's own drive and capacity for self-determination and collective resilience. By constantly stepping in to care for the community, the imperial power makes itself indispensable.
It fosters reliance, diminishes the community's will to solve its own problems.
Yes. The community slowly loses its muscle for self-governance. It becomes dependent on the care from the very system seeking to control it.
And finally, behavior 17. Conflating global justice with imperial togetherness.
This explains how a globalized notion of justice, often defined by the imperial center, gets deliberately mixed up with a vague sense of togetherness or unity, all to legitimize their empire.
So instead of real cooperation between independent communities,
You get a top-down universal framework of justice imposed, often tackling important issues like climate change or human rights, sure. But the way it's done, the sources argue, diverts attention from genuine decentralized cooperation and local problem solving.
it replaces real solidarity with a state-driven imperial version of unity, where the powerful define justice.
Exactly, further solidifying their control. Taken together, these 18 behaviors paint a really comprehensive and frankly quite chilling picture of how dependency isn't just an accident. It's presented as a meticulously engineered outcome.
And when you look at these 18 behaviors through that lens of the anti-parent politicians we started with, it clicks, doesn't it? These aren't just things that happen. They're framed as deliberate strategies.
Absolutely. Strategies to erode human autonomy, to cultivate that very Huxleyan nightmare the sources warned about. They form the tactical blueprint for creating those mindless, consumerist zombie states.
So the pernicious outcome, bringing it all back together, seems devastatingly clear. The result of this anti-parent political psychosis and these pervasive modern imperialist behaviors is exactly what they said. A society where no one is prepared to lead or build.
The poor trapped by welfare systems that kill ambition. The rich trapped by corporate welfare that rewards connections over innovation.
And the general population, caught in the middle, locked in that relentless cycle of consumption and debt. Stripped of real agency. It's like a web of dependency that catches everyone.
And that is the Huxleyan nightmare, fully realized. A world where genuine human autonomy is lost, almost happily traded away.
Traded for comfort, entertainment, manufactured happiness. Replaced by those mindless consumerist zombie states where self-sufficiency isn't just rare, it's actively discouraged by the system itself.
People become less human beings and more human doings, just going through the motions the system requires, consuming what's offered, without deep thought or real self-direction.
And right at the heart of it, the sources hammer home the active role of politicians as the priests of this evil anti-human sect. Not just letting it happen, but actively cultivating it, designing the systems, implementing them, benefiting from a population that needs their constant intervention.
And we have to reemphasize that point about shared culpability. Uncomfortable as it is, the source material points to both the poor and the rich being equally culpable.
Each contributing to the dependency just through different mechanisms.
Exactly. It's not about blaming one group. It's an indictment of a systemic problem that ensnares everyone, because both groups, in different ways, derive their stability, however fragile, from that same imperial dependency-creating system. It's about understanding the roles people end up playing within it.
So why does all this deep, maybe dark analysis matter to you, the listener? Why should you care about these complex systems?
Because understanding them from the family level right up to global imperialism is absolutely crucial. It helps you recognize the forces at play that are constantly trying to limit your agency, your creativity, the health of your own communities.
It's about empowering you to push back, to reclaim a sense of self-reliance, foster real community bonds, become a builder in a world that often just wants you to be a compliant consumer, a mindless consumerist zombie.
Precisely. This knowledge is framed as the first step towards breaking free from that Huxleyan nightmare.
So today we've really unpacked a lot. We've seen how politicians, cast as anti-parents, supposedly invert the duty of raising independent people.
We've explored how this creates pervasive dependency across society, trapping both rich and poor in different ways.
And we dissected those 18 specific behaviors of modern imperialism, the strategies used to dismantle independent communities, often disguised as progress or care. It's a complex web.
But a vital one to understand, and the sources really highlight this ongoing tension, don't they?
They do. This constant imperial push to atomize us, dissolve our communities, versus our inherent human need for real connection, for self-determination, for the freedom to make our own way.
So the powerful question this leaves for you, the listener, is this. In a world that often seems designed to lull us into being mindless, consumerist zombies, to isolate us in a comfortable stupor, what does it actually mean to be independent today?
And maybe even more practically,
Yeah.
how can you actively contribute to building or sustaining genuine, norm-forming communities, big or small, in your own life? communities that resist these forces and instead champion real human flourishing.
It's a lot to think about. This deep dive has hopefully given you a shortcut to getting informed on a really profound topic, offering some surprising insights into the structures shaping our world.
We really hope it sparks your curiosity, empowers you to look deeper, and maybe inspires you to cultivate more autonomy and stronger community ties in your own life.